interpretation into English, Spanish, and French. And as usual, you just go to the globe at the bottom and choose the language you want to listen to. With that, directly over to you, Roberto. Roberto Suarez, the IOE Secretary General. Roberto.
Well, thank you to all of you for joining us in this effort. I think that we very much partner with many of you in relation with many issues related to human rights and business. And again, special thanks also to Andrea, to the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, because of the partnership that we have also with them, which also helps us a lot also to move many of the policy agenda that we need to bring forward in terms of anticipating the business approach. But also, of course, I want to thank all the other business organization partners and also external collaborators, which really help us also to make a difference in areas like climate change and human rights. Just you to be aware, what we as IOE, employee organization, are very much aware is that the connection between just transitions, climate risk, and litigation and human rights are becoming more and more intense. These trends are growing, and in a very sometimes not easy manner. Yeah? Just transition is a strong policy agenda where we are very much involved as IOE, but also the human rights considerations of the effects of climate transition are not minor. And we have also to be very much aware of what that means. The number of cases that we see, the number of litigations that we see also growing are affecting not just government, but also more and more business. And they are based on a right to a healthy environment that we should not deny. I mean, to some extent, we need to see what are the legal specific implications based on national regulation, based on national constitutions, but also based on the commitments that governments and also different stakeholders have undertaken. I also have to confess that it's hard sometimes to see and to try and to trace the exact human rights impacts of many of the individual business activities linked to climate. But we as business community should be aware, not just in general terms, but in more practical terms, how our green gas emissions, our activities on a daily operations could also impact on human rights. We have always been advocating in favor of having partnerships that really make a difference. And for that, you need also a kind of good alignation in terms of objectives, in terms of rhythms. But in order to build a real cooperation in an area which is of such complexity sometimes of climate change and human rights, we need good guidance. And that's what we are launching here. It's a conversation based on a good guidance on how we can integrate the two trends. For that, we need good practice. We need to learn from you. What are the main challenges? What are the main lessons learned? And how we can really anticipate the conversation and the action to be taken. So I don't want to take much more time. I just want to thank you. And I will be also very, very much looking forward to listen to all of you and to see how we can learn and how can we move together. Thank you very much, Matthias, for also leading also this conversation.
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you so much. And with that, directly over to Andrea Ostheimer, who is the director of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in New York. And also, Andrea, thank you so much for this partnership. We have together elaborated on this paper, which we launched, I would say 4 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago, or something around that. So thank you so much for your support and partnership. Over to you, Andrea.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm extending on behalf of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung a warm welcome to you to today's dialogue on this interrelation of climate change, human rights, and the effects on business and the business environment. Since the UN guiding principles on business and human rights have been passed in June 2011, the vector of climate change, the needs for adaptation and mitigation measures have gained tremendous significance. And it was in October 2021, this year, the UN Human Rights Council recognized for the first time the universal right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment in a UN resolution. Although not binding, it certainly can be seen as a landmark resolution. Proposed by Costa Rica, the Maldives, Morocco, Slovenia, and Switzerland, Resolution 4813 was supported by more than 1,300 civil society organizations, indigenous peoples groups, as well as 15 UN agencies, young activists, and business groups. And 50 major companies united in support of that resolution and called on member states to adopt the resolution that would allow them to protect their natural capital and to create the conditions through which business and communities can thrive sustainably. Ladies and gentlemen, currently we see a lot of support and commitment from the private sector for the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement on climate change. We have seen a lot of voluntary initiatives from the private sector, but also policy initiatives by governments. And more than 80% of UN member states already recognize the right to a healthy environment through national law, court decisions, or regional treaties. However, most processes in their implementation take on a silo approach and lack a multi-stakeholder component. We also often hear from private sector representatives, and particularly from the finance sector, that politics is lagging behind and the private sector could do so much more with adequate political frameworks. So, dear participants, as Roberto already mentioned, today's discussion is really based on a study that IOE and KAS commissioned on the nexus of business, human rights, and climate. It entails business views and considerations, and Brent Wilton, the author, will provide you later on with a short summary of the key findings. In order to provide this in-depth analysis, we had also hosted in October an informal consultation with IOE members, the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, as well as with the Global Business Initiative on Human Rights. So why are we doing this as Konrad Adenauer Foundation? Because it is important for us to strengthen the input of the private sector in policy debates, and particularly around the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. Already before the pandemic, it became very clear that global problems do not only need a multilateral approach, but also a multi-stakeholder approach. And we understand us as a builder of bridges between state and non-state actors, and we aim to break up these still existing silos in policy making. Political decision makers need to know what kind of frameworks the business community needs in order to address climate change whilst respecting human rights. But politicians also have to be aware about constraints companies might face, particularly in the context of global competition when it comes to due diligence obligations. So therefore, I hope that today's discussion can make a contribution, and I wish to thank IOE for addressing these interdependencies of climate, human rights, and business. And my thanks go to Matthias and his team for coordinating the study and for convening today's and the previous meeting. I would also like to thank all our participants for sharing your thoughts on the complexities of this nexus of business, climate change, and human rights, and for raising attention to these specific challenges, which still need to be addressed, be it on a national or global level. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope we will have a fruitful discussion.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And again, thank you so much for your support and your collaboration on this topic. We have now two key resource persons who give us a broad context on the issue about climate change and human rights. On the one hand, we have Brent Wilton. Brent Wilton is the author of the study which IOE and Konrad Adenauer Foundation has jointly commissioned on this issue. He is a former IOE Secretary General. He is a former Global Workplace Rights Director of the Coca-Cola Company, and he is now the co-chair of the Center for Sports and Human Rights. And there's hardly any person in the world who knows so much about business and human rights than him. The other person who knows exactly as much as Brent is Fernanda Hopmhai. She is the new member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. She represents Latin America and the Caribbean. In particular, the Caribbean region, of course, is very much affected by climate change. For them, it is not a theoretical debate. It is a very lively debate. It's about their survival, actually. Fernanda joined the UN Working Group just recently, 2 months or 3 months ago. So thank you so much for joining today. And the UN Working Group is developing at the moment guidance on this issue about climate change and human rights. So it is very pertinent actually to listen also to you and understand better in which direction the UN Working Group is going. So perhaps, Brent, we start with you with some key insights. Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Matthias, and thank you again, Andrea, from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. This has been an interesting journey to start on in terms of putting this paper together. But I think in terms of the issues themselves, they come as no surprise. The fact that human rights has a lens to climate change is a natural progression of the human rights debate, and I think we will see this continue to develop over time, and other issues that come to the fore in terms of how it's impacting society generally. I think one of the challenges that we have with the human rights and climate change debate is that it isn't new. There has been a lot of work done. Even under the existing UNFCCC, human rights has been in the outskirts and skirting around some of these issues for some time. Now it's bringing a lens to the debate, and I think business needs to welcome that nexus. I don't think business should take a defensive position with regards to these issues, because I think at the end of the day, business needs to articulate very clearly that no one business, no one person is responsible for climate change. And no one person and no one business is going to be able to actually rectify the challenges of climate change. It is going to require, perhaps for the first time, a real global multi-stakeholder conversation. And governments need to be the leaders of that. They have the state duty to protect, and the UNGP framework should not be forgotten as we move forward in this discussion. Because what we, I think, are going to see in some instances is people looking for someone to blame. We're seeing that already in my region with regards to the Pacific, where we are also, like the Caribbean, facing some challenges with some of our Pacific neighbors with regards to the impact on climate change in terms of the physical infrastructure where these people live, the impact on livelihoods, and of course also the threat of migration as a result of having to leave their places of birth. So I think it's very important that business does not position itself in such a way as it gets its finger pointed to. And Roberto pointed this out already with regards to the litigation that we're seeing starting to emerge. We can't have a naming and shaming approach to this issue. If we do, we're not going to get anywhere. People will just go into their corners and the fights will continue without the progress necessary to be made. Now, I think also the other challenge you have with this climate change debate, which again is a little bit different perhaps in the context of other human rights matters, is it is so historical. This has been accumulating over time. And so again, when you start to look at responsibility and who is going to be taking the lead in redressing this, it requires all of us to be involved in that. You can't turn back the clock and go back to the Industrial Revolution and say the companies that were around at that stage now carry forward that cost into the future. We have to actually draw a line under the sand on the history and say, okay, this is the situation we now have. What do we do about it in the context of now? So the IOE paper is very much a first attempt at getting our heads around this. And as I said, I think the collaboration between the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and IOE in enabling this work to come forward is an important step. But it's not the end of the journey by any means. And I think we are all going to learn through this debate what is going on with regards to how different parts of society are responding to this. But business does need to be at the table, and that's already been stressed by speakers this morning, this afternoon, and this evening, depending where you are in the world. And I think business needs to be very much on the front foot on this. I don't think it should wait to be invited into the discussion. I think it needs to come forward. I think it needs to come forward on the basis of shared experiences, helping others understand exactly what the implications of climate change are, both for a business, but also from the community that business comes from. Because again, it is important to remember, business is merely the community at work. And that community also needs to be part of the problem solving and solution finding around how companies react to and respond to the challenges of climate change. Governments have a big responsibility also in working through the balancing exercise that they have to undertake with regards to human rights as to how we actually apportion remediation costs across the society with regards to climate change. Business cannot be expected to be the one that writes the checks, because at the end of the day, many businesses have been operating in climate environments in line with government expectations and requirements. But we're already seeing that in some instances, those standards have negatively impacted climate change. So companies cannot be held responsible for doing what was legally required of them at the time. But business does need now to apply the same lens that we're seeing on human rights due diligence in other areas to start to explore what risks they pose to climate through their operations or through their relationships with others. And we're seeing that reflected now, particularly coming out of places like the EU, where we're seeing the debate on human rights due diligence now being articulated as human rights and environmental due diligence. So that nexus is already in the vocabulary of a number of people, and that's where business needs to go. It's not a new thing for them to do, but they're going to need help to understand it in terms of the consequences of the human rights impacts of their activities that may be affecting climate. But they have to go and find out. They need to apply that lens, and they need to do it quickly, and they need to do it on an ongoing basis. Government too needs to help by providing some clear guidance as to how companies can go about doing this. One of the concerns I see at the moment is the raft of different standards that are emerging at national level, which are going to complicate a lot of businesses. The other issue too is a lot of those issues that are being dealt with at those national levels only apply to some businesses, not all businesses. And climate change, if nothing else, is something that affects everybody, regardless of size, location, occupation, etc. And I think that we have to be open and clear with society as business just how big this challenge is and who needs to be part of it. Business can't do it alone, as I said. And so there's a big role for employer organizations in this debate to start to aggregate the experiences that their members are having as they explore their own human rights due diligence with regards to climate change. They need to come together and explore solutions with government and other stakeholders. Business needs to be perhaps more open to other voices in this area than perhaps they have been before. And the stakeholder groups they've currently been using for the purposes of other human rights due diligence may not be broad enough to encompass who they need to bring into the conversation in this context. But again, the naming and shaming approach is not the way forward, and I think business needs to be very clear on that. And I think we should not be shy in saying exactly what we need as actors in the society to be able to address these issues. So I thank you again for the opportunity just to outline a few of the thoughts that came through the paper. I hope everybody has seen it. I hope they enjoy reading it. But I think we also need now to pull from that discussion of that paper and companies' experiences, this 2.0 edition of this note, because as I said, this is a journey we're all really beginning to undertake now in a coordinated way that's going to require more big thinking as we go forward. So thank you very much for the opportunity, Matthias.
No, thank you so much, Brandon. Particularly it is 5 o'clock in the morning at your place. So for your commitment joining at that time where everyone from us is still in bed and having perhaps the first coffee. Fernanda, for you this morning, but so to say, one day earlier than for Brent. Thank you so much for joining. We understand you're extremely busy. So thank you for joining this conference, at least at the beginning, to give us a bit of framing from the UN Working Group, who is working very intensively at the moment. You also had, of course, the UN Forum, which was how many weeks ago? 2 weeks, I believe. 2 weeks ago. So perhaps it was also some remarks which you can bring from the UN Forum, which you have heard there with regards to climate change. Over to you, Fernanda.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Thank you both to the organizers for inviting me. And I apologize, I have a bit of a cold. I hope I sound okay. And yes, a bit of a busy schedule, having just joined the group less than 2 months ago. But I'm happy to be here, and I'm glad that this conversation is happening, that you're working on this very important issue that I guess has become an unavoidable discussion for us all as a humanity, I would say, right? And not only a discussion, but you know, an unavoidable course of action for, you know, the future generations. So I think that there's a huge role for the business community to play here in terms of, you know, not waiting for governments or states to figure it out, but to, you know, take the lead as possible in these discussions and starting to actually, you know, revise their own practices and operations, and thinking that, you know, addressing this huge crisis, which is the climate crisis, and probably the biggest challenge we're going to face as a humanity in the next 10 years, might imply, you know, changes in operations, changes in business models, you know, changes in our ways of lives as people, as consumers, and so on and so forth. So I think the sooner this conversation begins and this course of actions are defined, the better. So I really welcome that you are doing this as a business association, and hope that the associates are on board to, you know, have these difficult conversations actually, and start to think of solutions. So we have all this framework now, right? As mentioned before by Andrea and others, we have Human Rights Council Resolution 4813 on the right to a healthy environment. We have the declaration of COP26, and all of these things are from the last 2 months, right? But of course, we have the framework of the SDGs, and definitely the UN guiding principles, which I think provide us with a very broad framework that can help us understand the connections between the climate change and human rights agendas. And of course, I mean, the first thing is to really acknowledge the human rights considerations of climate change. What are those impacts on human rights? Who are the populations that are being mostly affected? And this affects us all. I agree with Brent, but there is also some increased vulnerability to certain populations, certain regions, you know, as the Caribbean or the Pacific, certain peoples as the indigenous peoples, and people working in, you know, rural communities or living in rural communities, and so on and so forth. People living close to the coasts, right? Even big cities close to the coast. So I think it is important also to really understand the differentiated impacts on human rights of people living in certain communities. In terms of our work as a working group, as it was mentioned by you, Matthias, we are working on a guidance on climate change and human rights, or trying to really, let's say, clarify how UNGPs can be implemented to address also the climate crisis, or some elements of the climate crisis, and where those crossovers are. Of course, reinforcing the duty of the states to protect, but also we're attempting to bring a bit more clarity to the business community on how to, you know, fulfill the responsibility to respect, also in the context of the climate crisis, and of course the discussion on access to remedies. So I think that just to give you some headlines, and this was also discussed at the forum in a session we had on climate change. Of course, there are considerations on human rights due diligence, right? So this is a very, very clear instrument for businesses to really do, let's say, an analysis risk analysis that includes, you know, environmental issues, including the impact or the contributions, let's say, to potential contributions to the climate crisis. And I think that there will be some good elements in terms of how do we apply, you know, due diligence, human rights due diligence with a climate change lens. So an emphasis on prevention for sure, but also mitigation measures, access to remedy, of course. And then I think the key word is adaptation, right? We should be discussing about adaptation. How do business adapt? How do communities adapt to this, what I think should be a new era for humanity, pretty much. And I also think it's very important, as it was mentioned, that there are, you know, multi-stakeholder spaces created for this debate, you know, that these bridges are built between different actors, and that there is a very constructive participation of all stakeholders in discussions with governments and other policy spaces where decisions are made in terms of how we're, addressing the climate crisis. So, next year, I think it's going to be a very important year for the working group in terms of the work around climate change and the UNGPs. We hope to have this guidance published sometime next year and also convey, different discussions and consultations around this issue. As you may know, there is now a renewal of the group. So we have 2 members in the middle term. I'm the newest, and then 2 of our oldest are leaving, Anita Ramasastry and Surya Deva in 2022. So I think this might be in my hands pretty much until the new members come in and hopefully join the party. But we're working together to set a process and hopefully have you all very involved in the discussions. Again, I welcome very much this effort. I think it's very important, again, for the business community to show a strong commitment on addressing this issue and understanding the human rights impacts of climate change and also what they can contribute to these solutions, right? So it's a big challenge, and I think these conversations are an excellent first step. Look forward to more. And again, thank you for having me, and hope we can work on this agenda together.
Thank you so much, Fernanda. And for sure, we're more than happy to work with you on this agenda and as any other agenda, actually, when it comes to business and human rights. So we're really here to collaborate with you, to give you input, to help you, and also to organize collective action. Now, anyone who has a question to Brand or to Fernanda, I understand Fernanda has to leave. So now is your chance to address Fernanda. I think Adil Asim, you have a comment on the question. You want to come in?
I'm not sure if the other participants, Matthias, can actually use the audio. So maybe if you want to.
Okay, then I will just look at it. So basically, Adil says, hi, everyone. Thanks for this great webinar. I'm jumping on Ms. Fernanda Hopmhai related to human rights challenges, focusing on specific communities and territories. How these communities can adapt while they have no access to climate risk intelligence, and how businesses can be part of local climate resilience. I'm in the climate risk industry. NGO might not be our direct customer, but we are 100% willing to do everything in our hands to make the world better by helping companies. Fernanda, you also probably can read it in the chat.
Yes, thank you so much. So, I mean, there's no right answer, I guess, for this question. I do think that there are many conversations that might be not on a radar, but that community and community members are having around these issues. And I think engaging with them directly, it's probably the best way to understand how they feel about adapting, to this reality. And I've been in different spaces with social movements and community members, and discussions are happening, right, with these communities. So I think there is, to the local communities, they generally look to either their governments for solutions or, for example, civil society organizations that also provide accompaniment to this communities. So I think it would be great if local businesses are part of those conversations, and hopefully, again, inclusive multi-stakeholder spaces for discussion and action are created also at the local level. And I think that probably you as an association of employers, that it has, a very broad reach globally, also with, business at the local and national level, can bring this agenda, really to the ground, right? Rather than only having those discussions, let's say in Geneva or among ourselves. Broadly speaking, I think working with local businesses, it's going to be very important, as well as engaging with local communities. So that would be my 2 cents.
And that is actually directly another question that I want to give to you, Fernanda, and to Brent, how to engage the SMEs, right? The small companies, how to bring them on board on this agenda. Fernanda, before you leave, directly over to you again, whether there's anything to add after you already spoke about the fact, that IOE has an important role to bring the agenda to the local level.
Yeah, again, I think of course, I think creating really materials that are very clear, for example, to addressed or directed to SMEs and local businesses and also local communities is important in terms of information on adaptation as well, or mitigation measures and so on. So hopefully, again, bringing these conversations to the ground and also bringing information to those businesses in a very clear way. And again, I think we're all aware of the climate crisis pretty much. Even we don't necessarily need to have the technical tools to understand everything, but we know things are happening. We see it, winter lasts less or lasts longer, or it's colder or it's warmer, et cetera, and we feel it very clearly in our daily lives. And I think that SMEs are also, people making decisions, and business owners and so on are very aware that this is happening. So it's a matter of, again, bringing the conversation and more information to the ground. And I apologize, I need to leave. I have another commitment. I really thank you for this invitation and opportunity.
Thank you, Fernanda, for joining us, and Merry Christmas if you don't speak beforehand. Brent, and there's also another question for you which came in, Brent. So we have the whole question about how to engage SMEs, and there was one question on how we can build in human rights concerns on efforts companies are already doing with regard to climate change, right? With regard, for instance, certification standards they're doing at the moment when it comes to climate change and environmental protection. Over to you, Brent.
Yeah, two big questions, and I think Fernanda was right with regards to the SME. It's the giving them the information in a manner and a way in which they understand. And of course, it's not just a big business problem. This is all business, and it includes in many parts of the world the informal economy. And I think at the local level, the business organizations, the employer organizations, the IOE membership need to be thinking about who they need to bring in at the national level into those discussions to have them at the national level. I think the IOE members should be facilitating that dialogue, working with others in order to be able to produce the materials that people need to understand what this is and what they need to do to actually engage in it. And I think that's going to be very, very important. And collaboration is the only way forward in this space. The other challenge you have with SMEs is, of course, they're always very busy. So how do you actually position yourself to be able to have these conversations at times which suit SMEs, not necessarily just big business? And I think that's a challenge that employer organizations have found across a range of different issues, that people aren't free to go to 2-hour seminars or have access to the web in order to participate in Zoom calls. So how do we do that? And language. We need to be able to translate this into languages they understand. The other question, Matthias, around how do we integrate this into what's going on, that's exactly what has to happen now. I mean, companies need to be thinking about, okay, what does our human rights due diligence look like? And how do we then start to move into the space of environmental human rights analysis? And certification schemes can help, but certification schemes need also to help business understand how to get certified as acting appropriately. And again, there's not a heck of a lot of information out there at the moment to really help people. And I think Fernanda's comment about not waiting for government is very, very true. And I think there needs to be a series of big convenings. The IOE can play a role in this to bring together certification schemes. What are they looking to do? How is that going to align with what is needed elsewhere? So that we start to get some coherence around this. We already have the problem of governments working in silos. We don't want different parts of the business community or other parts of society working in silos on this, because it's not going to work.
Thank you, Brent. And there came just a comment from Paul, and I directly pass it to you, Brent, before we go into our great panel. And that is related to the whole issue about liability, right? And that the UN Guiding Principles say that companies are liable for what they are causing and contributing to. And how is that actually then referring to global warming? And the other point is how we can use these due diligence concepts for climate change, right? Where it is much harder actually to identify who is the one who is suffering, right? Who is the person who gets the harm when I'm a company Paul is based in Berlin. In Berlin, right? How do I identify who is the person who I've harmed with my impact? Over to you, Brent.
Yeah, and then this is, Paul always asks a good question. This is an important one to think about, because at the end of the day, how do you quantify a company's individual contribution to CO2 emissions? If you're in an industrial park where all sorts of stuff's going up chimneys, how do you say, well, this 2% is yours, this 5% is mine, I'm responsible? This is where government has a role to play in terms of helping business understand how they can mitigate such issues. And don't forget, I mean, we're seeing litigation now around CO2 emissions, which have been occurring in accordance with national legal requirements. So even the fact that, you know, these were legitimate targets on CO2 emissions are not stopping people wanting to litigate on it. And that's where government's got to step up and just say, hang on, look, we need to think about this in a new construct than individual liability. And the due diligence concept, I mean, I don't think there's a big change that needs to occur in the UNGP application to climate change. It's just bringing in within the business your environmental people, your human rights people, your procurement people, your design people, as to how to actually start to look at human rights and environment. I keep thinking of waste recycling. That's a classic one for many companies are dealing with at the moment. They could start there. And that's not just looking at the implications on waste on pickers or kids that might be working on dumps, but what are the health implications of that as well? And that just requires an expansion of the lens. And I'm sorry, but this whole human rights journey that we're all on is going to have a widening lens all of the time. And we've always said at the outset with the UNGPs, this is a marathon, not a sprint. And climate change is very much a marathon, not a sprint. And that's why government has to set expectations with its societies so that people don't think a simple legal action against a company is going to give them satisfaction that climate change is going to be reversed or ameliorated. It's just not going to happen that way.
Thank you so much. And that was a great part to go now to our panel, which is with Ron Popper. Ron Popper is the CEO of GBI, the Global Business Initiative on Human Rights, and he was before the Human Rights Lead in ABB. Noreen Kennedy is a Senior Vice President from USCLB, our US member, and has been engaged on the topic of climate change for many, many, many years. We have with us Kusum Kiata, who is the Program Officer for the Mitigation Unit of UNFWC and CCC. And we have with us Angela Kariuki, who is from the UNEP Law Division. So thank you so much for joining today. We have basically 3 questions to you, and perhaps we take 2 questions like into one, so you have really can comprehensively answer to them. And that is, on the one hand, where do you see the linkages between human rights and climate change? And what you think is the main challenge there, right? The main challenge for business, of course, but also particularly to you, Kusum, and for you, Angela, when it comes to state actor. So Ron, over to you.
Thank you, Matthias, and thank you to all the previous speakers who've actually said much of what I wanted to say. Thank you, Brent, for that. I think, first of all, congratulations on the report. I think it's much needed, and there are very valuable contributions and thoughts in there. Because I do see that this conversation about climate and human rights really needs to be brought down to basics in companies, as Brent said, so that people understand that the simple actions could have major implications, that it affects every single department. It's not just siloed into one department. I actually think that it all starts in the R&D department. That is the area where the link between the environmental impacts and the human rights impacts of a new product or process needs to be investigated in great detail, and in some companies it is. But yes, it permeates every single activity within the company. I don't think we have to make the link anymore between climate and human rights. I think this report is very helpful. I think we possibly need to spell it out very clearly in very practical terms for business, for SMEs. You know, the impact of business on air, water, soil has human rights as well as environmental consequences. Very simple stuff like that needs to be spelled out. The just transition has already been mentioned. The transition out and its impact on jobs, livelihoods, communities, the transition in and the demand for more minerals and metals, what kind of environmental and social impacts that's going to have. So I think it's a question of spelling things out very, very clearly, as you have certainly started to do in this report, and as the UN Working Group will continue, etc., etc. I think many large companies have clearly recognized the environmental, societal, and human rights imperatives in developing net zero targets, producing innovative technologies, rolling out energy efficiency programs and so forth. But I still see a lot of corporate PR, which still represents such programs in mainly environmental terms. Even though there's a growing recognition that this plays into corporate purpose and the social license to operate, it's still presented very much in terms of energy efficiency, net zero targets, in environmental terms. And I think we need to help companies expand that PR horizon as well. On the positive side, I think we're also starting to see companies, large companies, but not many at this stage, but certain companies declare that specific environmental or climate impacts from their business activities are among their salient human rights risks. I think that's a very welcome development. They're making that link overtly, and I suspect we'll see a growing corporate recognition that particular activities have both climate and human rights risks. We haven't mentioned the issue of ESG, and I think we ought to do so, particularly in the context of silos. There are still a lot of internal silos within companies. We've noticed in our work in the Global Business Initiative on Human Rights that many companies are thinking about taking a more holistic approach to ESG, but there are still so many silos. There is a growing recognition that the E and the S are clearly linked, and that the S is primarily human rights, and that neither can be approached satisfactorily without the G, the governance. So I think companies are starting to wrestle with that issue of how to break down those internal silos, whilst recognizing that certain processes, methodologies, and reporting may be significantly different, and see that there are benefits in viewing environmental and human rights impacts as two sides of the same coin. I think we're starting to see movement in that area, and it's one of the main issues, one of the many issues that we've been grappling with during the course of this year within GBI, how to achieve a more integrated internal company approach to impacts on people. Forget about human rights, environment, it's about impacts to people. And a more integrated approach will be clearly driven by a number of different factors. Leadership, regulatory change has already been mentioned, supply chain resilience, changes to corporate strategy and tactical decisions ushered in by climate change, the need for a just transition respecting rights, changes in investor approaches and priorities, and so forth. So there are several such developments implicitly or explicitly making the link between climate-related challenges and human rights performance. And I think we really need to spell them out and work much more within companies to break down those silos so that a more holistic approach with better results is taken. So I've got more to talk about later, but that'll do for now, I think.
Thank you so much, Ron. That was already great. And everyone who has a question, please just put it into the chat or into the Q&A, and we will pick it up, I promise. Noreen, when we had the first round of consultation with you and working group on this topic, you pretty much made us aware that this is not a new topic, right? In the UNF triple C, you know, we have discussed this issue for many, many years. So for me, however, it seems nevertheless that there are many new developments. We have now the resolution from the Human Rights Council, you have COP26. So where do you see actually these developments going to?
Yeah, thank you, Matthias, and thank you so much to the previous speakers. I learned a lot from you, and it's really an honor to be with you again here today to continue what is going to be a long discussion. I mean, I think, Matthias, you drew attention to, as did Brent, the fact that, you know, this is a very long haul challenge. I can reflect that we've had 26 conferences of the parties. Well, how many miles are there in a marathon? It's like 26.2. So we've already run one marathon. And with climate change, it looks like it's going to be an ultra for all of us. So it's good that we are taking such a broad view, because then the second observation to make, and I've been making it for some time, but I think we're now seeing it as we understand what happened in Glasgow, and as some of us were on hand there, that the climate change issue is really about everything. It really touches just about every kind of economic and human activity in some way, shape, or form. And of course, because of its incredibly comprehensive and inclusive nature, it's going to touch human rights. And it's not going to touch only environmental human rights, as vital as they are, but it's also going to create implications and also opportunities. I should say it's not necessarily all negative. I mean, in terms of the way we think about addressing the climate change topic, we can also think about, and the business community can also think about, ways in which we can create human rights positive and people positive solutions, whether it has to do with access to energy, sustainable energy, whether it has to do with food security, employment, what have you. It's very much the case that as we're looking to mitigate and address risks and negative outcomes, I think going to Ron's point, and I thought it was an excellent one, getting the creative juices flowing, getting the smart people in the innovation and research and development and product development departments of companies of every sector, thinking about how they can add value, where they can bring forward solutions, so that instead of thinking, and of course, I am not myself an expert in these issues of human rights, I have to confess that at the outset, but when I hear the words due diligence, it sends the signal to my American ear, which is very tuned into litigiousness and compliance and doing the minimum, of some kind of checklist. And as long as you check all those boxes, you're done. You don't have to worry about it again. But I think in this particular space, we have to have a different idea and a different mindset when we think about how we can address and look ahead to those human rights positive, people positive solutions to climate change. Where are the SDG-wide opportunities that we can pursue? So I think it's not a question just about the linkages between climate change, human rights. It's the linkages between those two things to everything else. So that's not an easy thing, obviously, to unpack, as we saw in Glasgow, right? I mean, Glasgow was a record breaker. We had, on every metric that you can think of, COP26 had an incredible turnout of people from, every constituency, as well as from government. If you look at heads of state, if you look at CEOs, if you look at the number of businesses that were on hand, I mean, that is just an undeniable signal that climate change is fully taken seriously and has been internalized as an urgent priority by the business community. So that is good. We have reached that, and that is quite commendable, but we're far from finished. I think one challenge we have is that as we think about what the necessary policy infrastructure is to animate and mobilize those human rights positive and people positive solutions to climate change, it's not entirely clear that the current approach is the right way to go. I'm not trying to criticize, and I certainly admire the tremendous achievement of COP26, both in terms of the intergovernmental outcome, but then also what has been announced by so many individual companies, groups of companies, multi-stakeholder. That's all fantastic and important. For the most part, seemingly focused on the mitigation side of it, but it's not enough in addressing the challenge that we're talking about in this panel today. It's not about increasing our ambition. It's rather enhancing how we get where we all need to go together. And so some of that is on the policy front, getting the right kinds of policies and making sure that governments can actually implement those policies, that they have their capacity in place, that the resources are available, et cetera. But without that, I think it doesn't matter what the targets are. I think a couple of other really key areas of opportunity have already been mentioned by other speakers and by Ron just a second ago. I think certainly the just transition gives us a very useful framework in which to look ahead, to look forward and think about how we balance the different impacts on people, both positive and negative, and find a way forward together. So for workers, of course, for communities, of course, and for employers, so that when we talk about that just transition, the transition is not a disruptive transition. We don't suddenly find out that the cost of heating your home is going to double over the course of the winter. That's not really a transition that will serve people very well, no matter how well-intentioned it is and how urgent the challenge. So we do have to think about all of those rights, all of those orientations towards people, and getting those right, working together and having a co-created solution. I think another opportunity is to expand our vision in the business community much more towards adaptation and resilience. And again, looking outside of just climate change, making air quotes, to water and food security, to emergency preparedness and response, and to the development of products and services that actually anticipate possible impacts of climate change. So I think we in the business community can do a lot more to create those links and to create opportunities that are profitable for the business community and therefore ones which we can embrace and build up and scale up, but also to engage our communities more, to work with governments more. And I have some specific ideas about how to do that, but maybe I'll save those for the next round of questions. So thanks again, Matthias, and I'll stop there.
Thank you. Indeed, that is the cliffhanger. The great comes in
right.
the next round.
Suspense.
Exactly.
Suspense.
Exactly. There was one question to you, Ron, and we come to you just that you can start thinking about it. How do we measure the impact on people, right? What kind of metrics can we use? So during we go now to Angela and to Kudum, you can think about how you measure actually the impact on people in terms of climate change when you are an individual company. But Angela, I saw you often nodding. On the one hand, when Brent was raising the issue about litigation, that is not really fair if companies operate in a legal framework, they are completely compliant with the law, and now this litigation is brought forward. But I also saw you a lot of nodding when Noreen saw business can do more. So perhaps if you can speak on both of that would be great. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Matthias, and thank you for inviting UNEP to be part of this discussion. And yes, I was nodding when we were talking about the litigation, because UNEP's work has really been, when it comes to this human rights and environment relationship, has been very legal in nature, providing technical and legal advice to states, to policymakers, judiciaries and parliamentarians, ranging from policy advice on taking a human rights-based approach to climate change laws, to working with judiciaries to sensitize them on the interlinkages of human rights and climate change so that they can use that knowledge in their interpretation when matters are brought to their courts. And also to tracking the litigation related to climate change and human rights, including those matters that are brought by environmental human rights defenders. And that's a big part of our work at UNEP, is to provide more support and protection for these defenders. And as others have mentioned, the recent recognition by the Human Rights Council for the first time ever of the right to a healthy environment has also really been a key moment for our work, and one that we've supported since the establishment of the mandate of the independent expert at the time, and now the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. But a few years ago, we relaunched this package of actions as the Environmental Rights Initiative, as we wanted to recognize and to address the growing need to bring more visibility to this work and to also extend its scope. And again, I was nodding when the previous speaker was talking about business needs to do more, because one of the main drivers behind the initiative is to work with a larger variety of stakeholders, including for the first time business and private sector actors. It's not historically been a stakeholder group that the law division in particular has worked with. So one of the activities that we're doing under this initiative is the work we started to identify entry points for UNEP in supporting businesses to meaningfully consider the human rights and environment relationship in their operations, with the aim of supplementing existing guidance or creating new tools. And this is what others have spoken about, is that there's really a forest of guidance and initiatives out there for business and human rights. And I think this is one of the ways in which the UN system can collaborate with businesses, is to translate much of the normative work and materials into concrete actions that businesses can take. But one notable challenge that I found when doing this gap analysis for this work is that there's often this tendency to think about environmental or climate change concerns, quite separately from human rights. And this is despite the case law telling us otherwise. Many of the global business and human rights cases that we've seen have a climate change dimension. And there's also all of these other guidance materials out there, which may become quite onerous for many businesses to address. There's just a ton of them. So it might be difficult to, decide where to start. Of course, the UN guiding principles is a good first place to start. But I think moving towards more responsible industry will really require a bigger push to make the current responsibility frameworks and guidances more practical, to enable businesses to address the environmental, the social, and the human externalities of their activities. And I think maybe in some cases, a lot of companies may still be unaware of new sources of value, and consequently are not fully addressing the economic value of the business and the value to society. I think industry really has this important role in providing potential solutions for sustainability, and at the same time, discovering these new sources of value creation. So in this sense, the corporate responsibility is to both the society in solving environmental and social problems, and then also to the shareholders for securing new sources of value creation. And it's really also well known, I think, that projects that are carried out in the name of economic development have often resulted in high levels of human rights abuses and potential violations, as well as violence. There's also increasing pressure on businesses to take reasonable means to ensure the transparency and the openness of their operations and decision-making, and to encourage the prevention of environmental harm, or even a proactive contribution to the attainment of sustainable development. Because we all agree on what responsible industry should ideally look like, and that's the reduction of environmental impacts and a smaller pollution footprint, ensuring the safety of people and the planet, and then also upholding rights, all while creating jobs and prosperity. But beyond calling for direct action by industry to take ownership of these externalities, the environmental, social, human rights that are part of the core business, we need to do a bit more as UNEP as well, to use our normative mandate and convening power and legitimacy to help businesses actually get closer to this point. So yeah, there's several ways in which business and the private sector can contribute to the implementation of laws and regulations as well, that not only advance corporate responsibility, but also contribute to the achievement of environmental goals and genuine respect for human rights. And I think UNEP is well placed to support businesses in these objectives, because I think these relationships between the responsibilities and the environment or climate change and related human rights is still at the moment somewhat unclear. For instance, when you look at the SDGs, the relationship between implementation of the SDGs and the responsibility of businesses to respect human rights in accordance with the guiding principles has received increasing attention, especially when we think about international CSR. But the SDGs have also been criticized for failing to fully grapple with human rights and climate justice issues. I think I'll pause here, Matthias, and I'm happy to share more later on the next steps and suggestions to address some of these challenges. Thanks.
No, thank you, Angela. That was really helpful. And I believe when you speak about these forests which are out there on guidance, or you spoke of tons and tons of guidance, I think the challenge is how to make sure that these tons of guidance from New York, Geneva, Bonn, Nairobi actually go to the company, to the local level. And we really can help there as IOE, and we committed to help you there, because what we can do is really through our network representing more than 50 million companies to make sure it reaches actually the companies, right? It doesn't stay on the internet side of, somewhere in UNDP where a company might not look like for, right? Because they don't know that it is there. So I think that is very important. The other point, which is really heartbreaking, is the fate and the danger of human rights defenders and environmental defenders, right? Which are really in danger in so many regions, and where we really need to think about what we can do actually for these people to make sure they are safe. So I think that is an important topic to look at. Kudum, thank you so much for joining us. You probably and Noreen are collaborating for many, many years in the UNFCCC. I will learn it until the end of this webinar, but I have one excuse: I'm German, I'm not English speaking. Troubleshoot. So Noreen already spoke about the fact that many of these issues, we have discussed for many years, but now with COP26 and also with regards to many other developments, it becomes a huge urgency. Anything you can elaborate on that and what you are doing from the Secretariat of the UNFCCC?
Thank you. First of all, it's a pleasure to speak on this particular event today. And this is for the first time I'm making an intervention in a human rights events, although it closely relates to my work, but my main work is happening around just transition. So first of all, thank you for this very important event and inviting me to share my thoughts and how does it really link. And this, when I was listening to all of you, and I was trying to go back to my childhood, like when I used to see what as a human right is, I was being preached that the earth is like that we all have equal rights to air, environment, on water, and these natural resources which are there, not talking about mining. And no one can take that right from anybody else. It's available free, it was clean, it was fresh, rivers were flooded with very nice water available for us. But when I grew, I find that this climate change is actually taking away that basic right, which all of us felt that this is something we had. And I would say that compromising this basic right is not something very simple. It has very big consequences on us. And this increased greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, this has further negatively impacted these basic human rights. Vulnerable people who have really very little contributed to it have been impacted very adversely, including our future generations. I think we all have spoken about it and we heard about it a lot during Glasgow, that future generations will not receive exactly or in the same shape as we receive from our ancestors, and we have some liability towards them as well. So we are not talking about human rights from current generation, but we are also talking from future perspective. And these impacts are very disproportional impacts. And this is where the work which we are doing comes into the picture, because rightfully this Paris Agreement, though it acknowledged that parties should, when taking actions and address climate change, respect, promote, and consider their respective obligations on human rights, but do we really see that? What human rights actually we are talking about? If we see, you mentioned, I think Roberto mentioned that there are implications which are not minor, and there are a lot of work which is happening around in this related to climate change, but does it really get into the work which is being focused on this? Are these guidelines which have been produced by all different organizations, are they catering to the right needs? Climate change has already impacted negatively people's rights. It is related to health, housing, water, food. And now even these actions which have been taken to address climate change, they are also addressing disproportionately our people. We are talking about individual groups, people who are in a vulnerable situation, including women, children, older person, indigenous people, minorities, migrants, rural workers. And we hear this in all forums. It's not something new which we are hearing today. And when I work in this area, like we have right now working on this just transition issues to taking care of work aspects. And even that particular small area, if we look at as a human right, like people have jobs today and we are taking actions. Are we taking enough actions in terms of taking care of that nobody loses their jobs, or the emerging jobs they are catering to what we need to? Or these emerging businesses are giving quality jobs or decent jobs to people? Are our governments ready to put forward the mechanisms or legislations in place that these rights, human rights, are being taken care of, whether we have decent policies in terms of pension schemes or compensating to people who are going to be redundant in these new schemes coming in, or new technologies, new businesses coming in. They don't find any future in that. And this is something I think we have talked a lot about it, but very less actions. And why I say very less actions? If we see our NDCs, which are being given like updated NDCs, it's a very small share of countries, like 32% of countries have even mentioned that there is going to be a policy, or there is going to be a just transition mechanism, or they will be taking care of jobs. This is going to be lost. It's a very small proportion. And why so? So although we have spoken a lot, we are saying that the work is happening. There are legislations coming in from different directions. There are even 2 declarations which came recently at COP24 and COP26 related to just transition. And if we see how many countries have really signed it, and although signing does not really mean that they are being implemented, but even signing itself shows a very lower level of commitment. So we see that commitment is there. We all are trying to get there. But I find that the challenge is that countries are still struggling. What is the priority and where is the balance? Whether the mitigation is a priority, or an adaptation is a priority, or human rights is a priority, or taking care of these jobs or other things which are being lost, is it a priority, and how to balance that? So there are very limited, I would say, experience to share. And you mentioned about it, to touch about the methodologies and tools. The guidelines are coming in, but if the countries want to really act, I have seen in the work which we are doing on just transition, there are very less examples or experience for countries to share. There are no tools, methodologies which are available. Countries are struggling to see when they are preparing their NDCs. If we take this, implement this policy, how many people are going to be impacted by this? How can we really take care of those impacts? The basic data is not there. The tools are not available. Whether we are talking about quantitative, is quantifying, like how many people are even employed in these industries. In some of the developing countries and poor countries, even this basic data is not available. How can they design policies to cater to these people? They will only know at the time when they will lose these jobs. And there's nothing else which can do, because they have been working on these businesses for so long. So again, we are not talking about that not to take action, but I think what we are talking about is how to make this transition, which is right for everyone, which is inclusive. And that is why I would say that the things which have been talked about is the social dialogue, having protection policies should be put in place. And whenever these NDCs are being designed, or the businesses' needs should be taken care of. If businesses are the one who are going to deliver this, government will give you framework, but businesses have to cater to it. And if governments are not ready to see what needs of businesses are, then it is very difficult to attain to the objective what we are aiming for. And since we are talking about it, I would like to say that there is a committee which is called Katowice Committee on Impacts of Implementation of Response Measures. There is a work program which is onward just transition of workforce and creation of decent work and quality jobs. And this is the space where we are talking about these issues. And we are going to develop a paper in next 6 months. And I'm happy to know if any one of you would be interested to be part of this development, where we are going to create more awareness and understanding of social and economic impacts of new businesses which are arising due to mitigation policies, so that we are not only talking about negative impact, but we are actually seeing what are the new businesses which are coming in, what are their needs, and how they are impacting socially and economically in countries when we are going towards low carbon emission economies. So I think I would stop at this moment here, and I am ready to deep in later on, Matthias.
Thank you so much, Kusum. And indeed, Robert and I came from 2.5 weeks on negotiations in the ILO on inequalities and the issue about climate change, and that it is, of course, a challenge and a threat, but also an opportunity, a business opportunity was very much present there. Now, thank you for that. Now we're coming to the second round. I'm looking at the clock. So if you have a question, put them in the chat. And Ron, you have already your question, which is basically how do you measure the impact? Yeah, well, you brought it up, now you have to answer. But there's another question which I want to raise, and that was, actually it was raised to the IOE, whether we need more sector guidance and whether we need more guidance for big companies, for small companies, so more targeted guidance. And that would be also helpful from you, Ron, to hear what you think, right? Is it more like you have one approach, or do we need to have more sector approaches and also more approaches to SMEs? Over to you. You're on mute. You're on mute.
Thank you. There are several questions in there. I'll try and unpick 2 or 3 of them. First of all, I really like the question in the chat about how do you measure, are there metrics? And I also hate that question as well, because it's extremely difficult if you're trying to measure the fact that you're not getting it wrong. It doesn't work that way, or it doesn't work well. I think there are certain sort of socioeconomic factors that you can measure, the standard of living of workers, communities, the health of the community and the workers, whether you're engaging in a living wage discussion as opposed to a minimum wage discussion. Your reduction of impacts, the strengthening of supply chain standards and resilience and so forth. I think there are things that you can measure. At GBI, we've been going through a whole summer of discussion on tracking effectiveness as demanded by the guiding principles. And it's a really difficult discussion because many companies default to some very basic KPIs, which don't really tell you very much at all. So I think the socioeconomic factors need to be looked at, impacts need to be looked at as an indication of whether you're getting it right or not. I don't think we have any common metrics. I think standards, reporting standards are developing, but we're nowhere near any kind of standardized approach. And indeed, segueing into your second question, Matthias, is it a good idea to have sectoral approaches? I think the basics are the same, but sectoral approaches are very helpful. If you're looking at, say, cobalt, lithium, which obviously have huge environmental as well as human rights implications, and renewable energy, like wind power and so forth, it really does help to break it down into specifics which are applicable, say, to cobalt in the DRC as opposed to lithium production in South America. I think that there are helpful guidance. It would be helpful to produce additional guidance for particular sectors, yes. I think part of the work that has to be done is also to help the SMEs, and I think Brent made the point quite clearly. We need to break it down into simple terminology and simple ideas that can be acted upon at a very local level. So I think it is incumbent upon business to help SME, big business to help SMEs do that, and governments help them to do that, but also to share tools as well. And just to round off, I was looking at a tool produced by a GBI member, which took an ESG approach to tracking risks at a local mine site. And I found that one of the best tools that I've seen in a very long while. It was quite detailed and it was still in its infancy, but I think those kind of tools can be boiled down and reused and passed on to SMEs as well. So I think there is some good work going on out there, but translating it into local effectiveness is a huge issue that companies, big and small, are going to have to face.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you so much. And we saw in the chat and in the question and answer, and everyone can look at it, a suggestion from, sorry, no, it's the chat fine, from Adil with regards to a tool they have developed to measure and prevent local human rights and financial impact of climate change. So perhaps, Adil, you can put in the chat the link to that so people can directly click on it and find out more. Noreen, the cliffhanger. Now we want to know.
Well, I just want to say something about metrics first, just to build the suspense even further. I mean, this has been a great discussion and very much appreciated hearing from Angela and Kusum. I do think that metrics are very challenging because there's no one size fits all, right? And what constitutes impact in one community is going to be, you know, not attainable, not relevant in other settings and with regard to other kinds of either negative impacts or positive impacts. Kusum talked about the Katowice initiative, and I think that would be extremely interesting since it will look both at measuring and trying hopefully to mitigate the negative impacts, but also to highlight where there are benefits, where that shared value has been created in the way that Angela talked about it. I have to say I'm a little bit more bullish on NDCs than I heard Kusum being in her comments. I'm a bit more optimistic. I think we have watched the slow progress on the NDC and the idea of the NDC as a tool that is tailored to each national setting and a tool which envisions continuous improvement, ratcheting up, not going backwards, but going forwards. And then thirdly, a tool which could hopefully be elaborated to evolve with what we are seeing more and more as the realities that are connected with reducing greenhouse gas emissions, including this point about just transition and human rights impacts. I'm very encouraged by work being done by the NDC partnership, which has been, you know, working very hard, I think, with different national governments, with different Paris parties to prepare high quality, inclusive NDCs. And I think that what they have done really demonstrates the potential of the NDC to bring both at the national level forward a conversation among the private sector, other stakeholders, communities, and the government about what needs to be done and how to do it together. But then also to take that collective picture and think about how it looks as more than the sum of its parts. I mean, Kusum knows that we also have a global stock take coming very soon. And while I think it's probably too soon to expect a major focus on human rights in the first global stock take, it's not too soon to start to talk about how that can be included, how that has to be a key element as we look ahead and, you know, get ready for the ultra marathon that I mentioned earlier. And I think it's also a good way to spark that innovation from the business community if one is already signaling what's ahead, even if we don't have the specific roadmap, but you know that future destinations are going to include human rights. That allows time for major business groups like the International organization of employers, its employers federations, other business organizations that are involved, to already prepare and plan and work with their members. I think this is going to take time. There's no fast answer, and the difficulties that we're encountering are real because this is a difficult challenge to take on, but one that we simply cannot fail at. So I'll stop there, and I hope it was worth waiting. I do think the NDCs and the global stocktake are a way to internalize the human rights concerns and hopefully opportunities in the Paris Agreement, which, as we saw in Glasgow, is now a central focus of the multilateral system going forward. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you so much, Noreen. For sure, worthwhile waiting. Angela, the question also with regard to guidance you saw in the chat is, there are obviously different guidance to government and to business, to federations, as well as to companies, I would even say, right? And when you spoke about the forest, which is outside there on guidance available, do you mean also guidance for all these different groups? There's sufficient guidance for governments, sufficient guidance for federations and for business individually, and also for SMEs perhaps? Because if that is the case, to be honest, I'm not aware of it. We, as I said, would be more than happy, more than committed to make sure it reaches the companies, the person it should reach. But over to you, Angela. What is then these tons of guidance which we need to bring to the local level you think needs to happen actually in order to make progress on the human rights and climate change agenda?
Yeah, thanks, Matthias. Yeah, and I'm really just talking about all the guidance that's out there for businesses when it comes to especially looking at environments and human rights. And there are a lot of them. So what we're trying to do at UNEP is to determine what practical actions we can take to add value to enable businesses to take climate action that respects human rights by going through all of these different guidances and identifying some gaps that we think we might be able to fill in order to bring businesses closer to that point. So, looking, when we're talking about business and human rights, looking at what good practices are already out there, how can we better engage businesses to understand those good practices and to assist others to replicate and build on them? What lessons could we learn about the implementation of the SDGs from the consideration of human rights and the relationship with the environment and climate? For example, if the attention is paid to the implications of environmentally hazardous industrial practices on those who are most vulnerable to climate harm, such as children, for instance, could this help to overcome unhelpful business trade-offs between jobs and the environment? So at the moment, this is what we're grappling with at UNEP, and we're working with the UNFCCC Secretariat, that's Kusum's colleagues, and the OECD on a practical tool on responsible business conduct in the context of the climate emergency. And through this, we're also focusing on a human rights-based approach, because what's become evident is that thousands of businesses and investors are committing to climate action, and they're already participating in various platforms, many of which the UNFCCC hosts as well. However, this climate crisis is interconnected with other global environmental threats, and these have grave human rights implications for those who are most vulnerable. So this urgent need for responsible climate action is also set against this background of a flurry of net zero policies and initiatives from governments, NGOs, and industry, and then the increasing risk of costly legal liabilities for businesses, given the expanding frontier of climate litigation that we spoke about earlier. So in this forthcoming tool, we're really considering these trends, the triple planetary crisis and human rights, as key elements of the context within which responsible business climate actions are required. And we're also looking at the OECD RBC instruments as tools that can be leveraged to better ensure that business climate actions are not only ambitious and effective, but also respectful of human rights and other environmental concerns. And I think the tool will also illustrate how responsible business climate actions can be advanced in relation to just transition, net zero commitments, nature-based and technological solutions, as well as climate adaptation and resilience, many of which we've spoken about already. And we're treating climate finance as a cross-cutting issue under each of the themes. And that's really where we are at now, is responding to the feedback we received from businesses during consultations with them on what practical tools will enable them to better action many of the guidances. And we hope that we can contribute to bringing about more real actions by businesses to move from a culture of compliance to one where human rights are meaningfully championed in climate action. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Angela. And if you have any link which you can put here into the chat so people can click on it, that would be extremely helpful. So just put everything which you think might be useful for us into the chat, and people just can click on it and download it for the last minute. Kusum, you more or less have the last word, which is powerful because Noreen challenged you. Now you can answer and there's no chance that she comes back. So that is your chance actually to say what you have to say without being challenged back again. Over to you, Kusum.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing this, Noreen, about this global stocktake and other aspects, which definitely look forward in bringing these issues forward. And I completely agree that yes, NDCs are a progressive action. We are all looking for the progressive NDCs in future. And I would say then that is what gives an opportunity, because we have already seen just transition is being integrated in many countries, NDCs, because there are some UN organizations like ILO or UNDP is providing customized service to in terms of assistance to their regional offices to integrate in this just transition in their processes when they're developing or updating their NDCs. And that is something which has helped a lot to many countries. And you can really see that in some of the NDCs, even the tools which are being developed by ILO, these NDC guidelines, the guidelines for just transition, or these tools like methodology for assessing impacts on jobs for people, they have been referenced and they have been used, like also for Ghana, I would say, and for Namibia. There are a few countries like that who has gone a little bit more deeper dive. And then there are some countries who have just mentioned it, like acknowledge that there are some issues and then those need to be addressed, but they have no clue probably. I would not say they don't have clue, but it has not been informative enough in the NDCs how these things will be really implemented in future. So that gives a little bit of uncertainty in terms of what is going to happen. And I would say that if we could have, I don't know whether this is the right approach or something, but if this climate human rights issues can be integrated firmly in some of the work programs. I cannot say whether it is an independent one or it has to be within the existing ones, but a firm hook would be good. Whether it can be in this work under just transitional workforce or impact of implementation of response measures, which is commonly known as mitigation actions, impacts of mitigation action, that is one place to have it. But otherwise, I think even in transparency mechanisms, what we have, reporting requirements, if we really ask countries to report on these aspects, which will oblige them to put in place some kind of monitoring, whether for the businesses or for themselves, it will help in terms of bringing some kind of alignment and development of tools and use of them, which have been existing. It is necessary for us that we have to build a consensus and make sure that all the stakeholders are being heard. And this is what is the nature of this inclusive multilateralism. And we have seen the power of it in past recently in COP26 as well, which was not a normal COP. And as mentioned by Noreen, like it was something which was commendable from all aspects in COP26. Parties made a lot of decisions, and this is not different for response measures as well. There are a lot of recommendations which are being given. For example, the parties are being told or are being encouraged to say that this will require financial flows which are consistent with the pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resistant development. And this is also for just transition, because we cannot meet our obligations unless we are able to handle these people-oriented needs. We cannot have ambition without addressing these negative impacts. So we can keep on saying we need ambitious or we want to reach the target, but these numbers means nothing unless we start implementing and addressing these issues which are important for people. And we are doing all of these actions for people. So for people, we have to take care of their needs. Finally, I would say the success of our collective efforts to address climate change and overall development for everyone, both of these things are very clearly linked. And there is no choice. If our target is to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, or we want to achieve 1.5-degree goal together with sustainable development for all, we must be considering and committed to these social aspects more and more in our implementations, in our businesses, in our policies, in our commitments, and in implementation. Thank you.
No, thank you, Kusum. That was a great final word. Actually, no one could have done it better. Thank you so much for that. I want to really recognize at the end 2 persons who had made this dialogue possible. That is Robert Marinkovic. Robert, switch on the camera. People can see you. Who is the lead when it comes to climate change, environmental impact, and so on and so forth. He didn't know that we call him in, otherwise he would have, of course, have a tie and a shirt. But otherwise, he is really the brain behind everything. And then Monique Dipierre, who is on sick leave, but still is so committed to make this possible. Monique, I don't request you to switch on the camera because I understand you're on sick. You do it anyway. Perfect. So thank you, both of you, Monique and Robert, for making this dialogue possible. Thank you, all the panelists, for your contribution. It was extremely valuable. There were 2 questions for the IOE in the chat. One, whether we make small islands a priority. Yes, we do. We actually brought small islands to the UN, to a particular UN summit there, and we will continue to do so. The other question was with regards to the paper, whether we don't separate between the state duty to protect and the responsibility of companies to respect. Yes, we do this differentiation, and I think it was in the paper, but perhaps we can do it even more clearly in the future going ahead. So everyone, Merry Christmas, a very good New Year's, and hope to see you in January back again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.